Live from New Hampshire, it's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.
Good evening and welcome to Science Cafe, New Hampshire. My name is Dan Marchak. I'm one of the organizers here. So my two panelists, feel free to join and sit in the right seat. Sure. So for those of you who haven't been here before, we've been doing Science Cafe for almost 9 years now. Can't let them get away.
No, not.
Almost 9 years now, and I have never, ever invited the wrong panelists to be part of a panel before. But unbeknownst to me, there are two Professor Beemers at UNH, and I happened to invite his lovely wife by accident, and I had to immediately say, oh, sorry, cancel that invitation. But she was so gracious. So tonight we have two panelists to talk about science fiction. One, Professor Beemer from UNH, and the other is Steve Davidson, who is the publisher of Amazing Stories magazine, which has a very long history, way longer than you could possibly have had. So maybe you'll tell us about that. How many people have not been to a Science Cafe before? All right, so there's a few. So here's how it works. I'm going to give the panelists a chance to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about who they are and why science fiction is important. And then we're going to throw it open to your questions. So we are recording this. We do rebroadcast these on cable TV. So please raise your hand if you have a question, and either Rick or I will bring you a microphone so that we can capture your question. All right, so with no further ado, Steve, you want to start?
My name is Steve Davidson. I've been immersed in science fiction since 1964. In 2008, I had the opportunity that I thought of a lifetime to acquire the trademarks for Amazing Stories magazine, which was the world's first magazine devoted exclusively to science fiction. And I've been working on bringing the magazine back out ever since. I've been involved with the science fiction fan community for a number of years, putting on our big event of the year where we hand out the Hugo Awards for Best Novel, Best Short Story, and those awards are named after the original publisher of Amazing Stories magazine, Hugo Gernsback, who provided the first definition of the genre in 1926. Magazine is published today, a television show you may have seen called Amazing Stories, produced by Steven Spielberg for Apple Streaming, has licensed the name from us to use for the reboot of the television show. Appreciate it if you'd watch, because ratings help our cause.
Hi everybody, I'm Larry Beemer. I teach at the University of New Hampshire in the English department. I've been a big fan of science fiction for much of my life. When I was in graduate school, I started out studying like Hemingway and Faulkner and Fitzgerald, and started gravitating more towards popular culture. So I've spent some time thinking about comic books. As it turns out, when I was at UNH, an opportunity to inaugurate a science fiction class came about. So I developed that about 5 years ago, and it's been running really solidly ever since.
So, who wants to start? Robert.
How much of science fiction might you think is science prediction?
All in all, the genre has a really lousy track record for prediction. I mean, we could certainly go around and come up with like maybe 20, 25 examples of things, Waldos, nuclear submarines, those things, cyberspace, those things definitely first appeared But I think that it had more to do with, it had a good deal of influencing young people who were reading it at the time, and then went forward to sort of create those things. As far as prediction goes, I don't like to think of science fiction as a forward. I personally don't look at science fiction as a particularly forward-looking medium. I think of it as a genre that is offering analysis sort of the present by extrapolating based on sort of an experimental introduction, right? So there's this idea of a new thing, right, or a novum. Call it an android or an alien civilization or faster than light travel or something that we don't have. And when we drop that into the world that we live in, the changes that are produced are very much situated in where we are right now, but then have sort of an ecological impact, like it changes everything as a result, allowing us to kind of have a better picture of what's going on by putting it into sort of an equation, if that makes any sense. Like I generally speaking, when I'm teaching science fiction, I like to make the point that it's not fiction so much that contains science as it is science that's done in a fictitious manner.
I believe that early on in the genre, particularly during what we call the Golden Age, which was dominated by Astounding Stories magazine and its editor, John Campbell, that the writing of science fiction was presented as a thought experiment, a deliberate attempt to game out particular speculation. Not so much prediction of the future, but a wide swath of different speculations on where things could or might go. And there are hits and there are misses. I like to think of it mostly about hurricane storm tracks. The weather program shows you 18 gazillion different ways that the hurricane might go, and one of them usually comes pretty close to its actual path. Well, that's the same as everybody who wrote about exploring the stars or going to the moons. But you do have these odd little things that happen where people tend to get it, probably statistically not that odd, but to get it very close to reality. In fact, one of my favorite examples is a novel, a young adult novel written by Lester Del Rey, in which the first man on the moon was named Armstrong. And that was written, I think, in '56.
I'd like to ask you if you might consider extending about science fiction, giving us a seed for the future in a couple of areas. One of them is, you should forgive the expression, politics, and the other is in social engineering, which is a science fiction term more than a current reality term.
We don't think about it specifically as a prediction, but there is this interesting positive feedback dynamic that goes on. There are many, many, many scientists and researchers and engineers who find science fiction early in their lives, and that becomes the thing that inspires them to go into the fields. And the stories that they read give them ideas that they are then interested in or capable of realizing or trying to realize. And at the same time, the things that are just coming out of the laboratories now are being picked up on by the contemporary science fiction authors, and they're taking those concepts and expanding them out into the future to see where they might develop. So it's this constant feedback, and it definitely plays. There's the Sigma group, which is a number of science fiction authors, most of them with science backgrounds, who inform the government on various issues largely involving space. There are other groups and individual authors, and now we're more in the realm of the futurist, but a lot of science fiction authors fulfill that role where they're hired by various industries to chart out where things might go for that industry in the future and ways in which that company might be able to effectively respond to those kinds of things.
Do you want the happy story or the sad story about? I mean, when you start talking about what does the future look like, I mean, you can kind of put it on a grid where you say there's an increase in civil liberty or a decrease in civil liberty, an increase in scarcity or a decrease in scarcity. And where it fits on that quadrant really kind of tells you what story we're telling, right? I mean, if you're talking about sort of authoritarian scarcity, you're talking 1984. If you're talking increased liberty, increased scarcity, you're talking about Road Warrior. If you're, I mean, there's sort of a lot of variations, but really it kind of falls into that 4 possible futures grid. As far as your question on social engineering, all social interaction is, in a sense, engineered, right? I mean, society itself is a technology. We think when we talk about technology, we often think about it in terms of consumer electronics. But really, technology is just anything that we make, right? So as early as crop rotation is an implemented technology. So democracy is a technology. However you go about it, something that didn't, fall out of the sky or appear, as a product of nature is something that we made. So as far as like how are these things going to, play out in technology, I mean, personally, I couldn't tell you.
All right, the next one over here.
So could you guys go back and think about either Edison or even further back? Was there writing that you would refer to as science fiction that was in the 1700s or 1800s? Or could you just put understand where a lot of this has come from?
Yeah, you want to, we could take it back to I would say 17th century. We could,
Or 600 AD.
right, yeah. I mean, I was going for Sir Thomas More. Who are you going with?
I was going to go with Lucian.
Okay. So there's prior to science fiction, there are a number of genres which deal with travel to fantastic locations, right? The science fiction stuff emerges as rocket technology emerges, the V2 and eventually the space program, but also as the globe finally gets completely mapped, right? I mean, that's how we move from Tarzan to John Carter of Mars. Africa is no longer a mysterious place. So if you're going to put a story someplace that's inaccessible, you're either going to place it in the future or you're going to place it in space.
Or inside the Earth.
Or inside, my phone.
There's 2 basic schools of thought within science fiction academia and critique land. And that is that one theory is that in 1926, the genre was defined as a genre, and that from that point forward, stories that fit the definition of that genre can be classified as science fiction, and anything that might come close from previous times is considered to be proto-science fiction. That's the school that I come down on personally. There's another school of thought that says that the fantastic imagination, the use of the fantastic imagination, we know goes all the way back to unwritten times, and that there are many examples scattered throughout history that can be considered science fiction. It's a bit broader of a definition of the genre than I'm comfortable with, but there it is.
Well, that leads to the issue of whether it's speculative fiction or science fiction.
Right.
There's sort of these large umbrella terms that there's a number of genres inside, right? So speculative fiction is any kind of fiction that is not intentionally representative of reality, right? So it's non-mimetic. If it doesn't hold up a mirror to the world that we live in. So inside of that, you can have things like horror, and you can have things like science fiction, and you can have things like fantasy and superheroes and all of these other things. And within those numerous genres, there's a lot of intersection and interplay, right? Like, have you ever seen a movie called Alien? Is that a science fiction movie or a horror movie? Right. It leans a little bit more horror, right? I mean...
But because we're all science fiction fans, we argue about these things.
Right. Oh yeah, we will fight to the death over whether Star Wars is science fiction or not. It's not.
No, it's not.
Okay, so we have a consensus.
All right, over here to your right.
I want to know why you don't think Star Wars is science fiction. And secondly, how about 2002, the one with HAL Computers?
2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah, is that science fiction? But anyway, the first question is why isn't Star Wars?
Magic.
Yeah. I have another definition. This one's from Rod Serling, who created The Twilight Zone and did a lot of great writing for television. In '62, he said, "Fantasy is the impossible made probable. Science fiction is the improbable made possible." So you've got lots of impossible elements going on in Star Wars. It falls into that category of definition.
So I mean I don't mean to be flip with the magic answer, but essentially, if you took this glass and I looked at it and I held my head and it was explained that I used telekinesis to move it from one location to another, science fiction. If I put my head to my hand and there is no explanation, it's something that's just an irrational force in the universe and it moves to a new location, magic.
It's not a hard and fast line.
No, it gets blurry.
And everybody takes their own position on where on the dividing line certain things like Star Wars falls. But it does engender a lot of discussion.
And this does not mean that I don't love Star Wars. I love Star Wars stupidly. I've seen Phantom Menace more than I care to admit.
Right. The next question, the same part of the
No,
room.
he asked about 2001 as well, and that's indubitably science fiction. And if you do a little research into the amount of work that Stanley Kubrick did to make every aspect of the known completely realistic, you come to the conclusion that it's nothing but science fiction. Now, the end is metaphysical. The star baby floats in on the orbit of Earth, and we don't know what's happening next. Arthur C. Clarke. But that was more of an uncomfortable ending and a way to end the movie because they had no real ending for the movie than it was a deliberate, this is an expression of science fiction kind of an ending.
Well, except for, I mean, like with Clarke's third law, right? Clarke's third law says that any technology that is sufficiently advanced would appear to be magical, right? But the big deal there is the word appearance. It doesn't mean that it is magical. It just means that it appears magical. So yeah, it crosses into the metaphysical, but I've always accepted that there was a rational explanation that was just beyond our conception.
Right, but then when you start getting into really deep into the science, if the species that creates the star baby and created the monoliths and everything are as advanced as they are,
it would appear magical to us,
right?
But it wouldn't be magic.
But why are they using such a stupid mechanism to convey whatever?
Right. Well, fair enough.
So my question, Gina Torres has stated in a couple of interviews that in science fiction, a woman like her, tall, African American, can really be whatever she wants to be. I'm curious as to what your opinion is about how science fiction affects our society as far as those who are maybe disenfranchised and not necessarily part of the white, straight norm that is generally seen as a regular society.
That's a great question. And it has been a remarkable characteristic of science fiction for a very long time, as probably back to the 26 date, if you're going to go there. Science fiction has been a vehicle for underrepresented voices to get their point of views out. So whether you're talking about the mid-1920s and the 1930s, there were a lot of Jewish authors who were not going to be able to make their way into the sort of capital L literary circles, who were expressing themselves in that genre. As time progressed, that increasingly included African American writers, women writers particularly, and each of those sort of groups have had massive impacts in that material. So one of the things that's always been great about science fiction, aside from the sort of the ability to imagine oneself into it, but to actually hear the voices of someone like you, has been a very, very important feature of it, right? And if this is an issue that you're interested in, I would strongly recommend you start reading Octavia Butler as soon as possible. They're doing her Exogenesis trilogy on TV. One of the networks. They're doing it pretty soon. But yeah, Butler's contribution to science fiction has been enormous. Le Guin's contribution to science fiction has been enormous.
Kate Wilhelm.
Oh, Tiptree.
Jemison.
I'm trying
Nora Jemison now.
I'm trying to think who wrote Dahlgren.
Oh, Chip Delaney.
Yeah, Delaney. Samuel Delaney. There has just pop culture has been a vehicle to the voices that aren't represented in what's regarded as sort of mainstream or proper culture. If you look at sort of the history of the Western canon, right? If you look at like the big books that we're all supposed to read in high school, they're books that not only represent a specific audience, not only represent a specific type of character, but represent a specific set of values that are associated with that type of character. So once you broaden that pool and bring in other voices, suddenly you have an opportunity to see something bigger than Hemingway or Henry James or Dickens or something.
So I just wanted to revisit what we were talking about a few minutes ago when you were talking about Star Wars. And you said wait, there's more to this, I promise. Okay. So you said you fell into the camp that it is not science fiction, and I understand why. I'm just curious to know, how do you feel about Star Trek? Because you have characters like Q, who seem to be magical. And in which case that would make it more...
That's not really Star Trek.
Well, that's the next part of my question, is how does the community view Star Trek? And do they look at something like Next Gen as more fantasy, and something like Discovery maybe a little bit more science fiction? So if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, that'd be great.
There is... I cannot stress this enough. There is no unified view on anything under the umbrella of science fiction. Okay, I love Star Trek. I love Next Generation, and I even like the Q episodes. He's a sixth-dimensional figure.
Well, that's Clark's Law again.
Right. It appears magical that he suddenly conjures a mariachi band on the bridge of the Star Trek, of the Enterprise, but...
Personally, having watched Star Trek in its original airing, from the stairs over my father's shoulder, because I wasn't supposed to be up that late, that's Star Trek to me. Everything else that has come since is a Star Trek-like thing, but it is not Star Trek. And I'll also refer to Gene Roddenberry, who is the creator of Star Trek, who basically determined as they were producing the first season of The Next Generation that I think his statement was something like, you can't catch lightning in a bottle twice. I don't mind it so much. I mean, I recognize that it's a continuation, that there are many admirable stories in Next Generation and some of the other Voyager and DS9 and etc. In fact, the new show Picard that's out right now, a writer that I know, Melinda Snodgrass, wrote the episode Measure of a Man for Next Generation that some of the major plot elements and characters in Picard are based on. So And I know a lot of people who write for and work on Star Trek in various capacities, and I know that they all love this property, and they all see it as one large continuum to play in, and an endless number of ideas. And that's really what it is. It's a framework for presenting stories in a particular way, and usually moralistic tales, which is one of the things that distinguishes it as a science fiction television show. But me personally, Star Trek is Kirk and Spock. That's what the script writers are setting out to.
Jean-Luc Picard is unequivocally the greatest captain that Starfleet has ever had.
Steve might disagree.
I think so.
It occurred to me while you were talking about the distinction between hard and soft science fiction. I was thinking about one of my favorite series. Melding of the two was the Kim Stanley Robinson series, Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars, and a gradual terraforming of Mars in a not too distant future, which could be definitely, there was a lot of hard science in that, but they were also creating the ideal society, bringing certain things, escaping from various things that we screwed up badly on Earth and creating the ideal society up there. So I was wondering what you thought of that series, which I adored, but I know it won a bunch of awards from your publication.
It's a brilliant and super important series. Actually, when we were talking about the distinction between hard and soft science fiction, that was going to be my go-to to say that they're inextricable concepts. You just can't, there's no such thing as a technology apart from a society. There's no such thing as a society apart from its technology. So as soon as you, I don't know, you kind of get into that, does a tree fall in the woods, and if there's no one around to hear it, it might make a sound, but who cares? Right? I mean, if... Conservation of energy. Well, yeah, but I don't know. But anyway, what I'm saying is that what Robinson understood was that, yeah, in order to implement these technologies, it requires a tremendous amount of cooperation in developing resources. It required assignments of roles. It required, labor timetables. It required all of those things, and those affect people. And then Robinson operated on another level with the interpersonal relations between the various characters. So, you're dealing with, I just don't think that you can deal with I don't think you can deal with a human topic in a vacuum that doesn't include a picture of humanity.
I started reading this stuff when the libraries didn't really distinguish in terms of fiction. There wasn't a science fiction section in the library. And I went from A to Z, finding all the books with the rocket and planet sticker on them. And that's everything from Abbott's Flatland all the way to Lord of Light by Zelazny and much in between. And I think that the most apt definition of the genre, which encompasses both hard and soft and all the other stuff, is Damn Nights, which is basically science fiction is what we say it is when we point at it. And that's very much my own personal experience. There are plenty of books that I have read that I thought were science fiction light or were really labeled incorrectly, and other works that should have been labeled as science fiction of one kind or another and weren't. And I really, for me, there was no niche marketing going on when I grew up with this genre telling me that this was a military science fiction novel, and since I enjoyed those kinds of novels, I'd enjoy this one. It was this cornucopia that you dove into, and you didn't really bother to distinguish other than to discuss whether this was a better novel than the last one the same author had written, or how it informed a particular concept running through science fiction at the time. Did you like the time travel story by this author better than the one by that author? Did they handle it logically? Those kinds of things. We weren't hung up on what the subgenres were and what category a particular work fit into.
All the authors tend to say about the editors how much they helped them as writers. What were the things the authors were kind of doing that wasn't right for Campbell, that he would make him work? Are there any stories you can share that you might have heard over time about how did they really change it? What was bad sci-fi that turned into great sci-fi?
Well, first of all, I'm not familiar with editing in other fields than science fiction and the specialty field of paintball literature, but my experience is that most editors in the science fiction field come in as fans of the genre, are authors themselves, and the kinds of things that they contribute can range anywhere from something as simple as we need to retitle this story because our audience isn't going to get your title, all the way through to regular massive rewrites, brainstorming sessions about how to handle a particular situation in a story. There is one well-known story between Campbell and an author named Godwin. The story involves a spaceship on a emergency mission. It's a specialty ship. It only has enough fuel for its mission, which is to bring a serum to a planet that's suffering from a plague. And a girl sneaks on board the ship, which renders it unable to complete its mission unless she's forced to step out the airlock. And Godwin rewrote this story and rewrote this story and rewrote this story with a happy, successful ending where nobody died, and Campbell kept on rejecting it and rejecting it and rejecting it until they came up with she goes out the airlock, end of story. The Cold Equations. The Cold Equations is the name of the story. Campbell was unique for his era in the field because he was so influential. That started with him being able to pay the best rates in the industry. And where are you going to send your stories first but to the magazine that's going to pay the highest word rate? But he also had this vision that expanded on Gernsback's definition of the genre, which took it into this literal thought experiment kind of realm where you posit something about the future and then you extrapolate rigidly from outwards from that initial concept, whatever it might be, and examine how it would impact society, for example. Asimov's robot stories, particularly the novels like The Caves of Steel. He has a whole society on Earth that's basically living underground. And he posited that, extrapolating from the idea that the population of the Earth, of humans on the Earth, was never really going to be brought under control, and they needed to find a mechanism by which such a huge number of people could be supported. And so the speculation goes on out from there. Somebody else once said regarding that it's one thing to predict the automobile or conceptualize the automobile. It's another thing to conceptualize the traffic jam. And that's the realm in which good science fiction exists, is trying to extrapolate the traffic jam out of the concept of the automobile.
Right now, so to speak, who are your favorite, you're glad it's in the library and you tripped across them at some point?
I just read a great, we have a generation of authors that are coming up now who are very familiar with the field in all of its aspects, and they're now playing with the very initial concepts of science fiction in like a fourth order kind of meta level. The author his last name is O'Neill, and the novel is The Robots of Gotham. It's probably the best thing I've read in the last 2 years. I won't go into details. I don't want to spoil anything. I mean, I really like Heinlein. I grew up on Heinlein. Probably exposed to Heinlein too young in life. So any of the ABCs, Asimov, Clarke, Heinlein, Bradbury. if you like interesting things that range all over the spectrum, somebody who covers a lot of territory, is an author named Philip Jose Farmer, and he's taken some, he took like some characters from Burns Around the World in 80 Days and added a whole alien war level to it. Yeah, he's quite creative. He's written Tarzan pastiches, he's written all kinds of other authors' workups. And contemporary, I think, I'd be remiss if I didn't recommend Nora K. Jemison's recent series that all 3 novels won the Hugo Award for Best Novel for the year. She's quite the fantastic writer.
My list is much shorter. I would say Philip K. Dick is where it starts. Neil Stephenson, Snow Crash is probably my favorite sci-fi book of all time. And I would say, published over the last, say, 5 years, I would read the Jeff Vandermeer Southern Reach trilogy.
If you look at where science fiction was, I mean, you look at Jules Verne, I mean, they had submarines back in the Civil War, but 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, science fiction then, this is going in and out. We're cruising under the seas very well. Man in the Moon, already done. You look at the iRobot series and the stuff that you see now where they're developing robots is phenomenal. Genetic engineering, all that. There's a certain point where I think science is going to start catching up to science fiction as science grows more and more exponentially. So with that kind of basis, I'm wondering, where do you see the future of science fiction going once there's no more, well, as there's less and less science that's fiction, when it becomes more either just a plain fiction story or a science nonfiction story? Where do you see the future of science fiction going as science sort of catches up to the books?
There's a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done with climate issues, and science fiction is really picking up in that area. There's a book that I'm thinking of called The Wind-Up Girl that very much treats this. Also, well, the Vandermeer stuff is actually all sort of like environmental horror kind of material. The other thing is science fiction, again, to sort of move away from the sort of the search for the definition, right? Every anthology of science fiction begins with a chapter that says, what is science fiction? And every one of those chapters ends up being unsatisfactory. And the thing is, it's not so much about figuring out what it is to come up with a definition. It's really about looking at what it does, right? Like if you were to sort of come up with a definition for a hammer or a screwdriver, really what you're talking about is not the material differences or the differences in production. You're talking about differences in its functionality, right? So science fiction is a literature that theorizes. It's one that extrapolates. It's one that engages with possibilities. So as long as there's a tomorrow, there's a future. It's just built into the way we experience time. As long as that's present, then I don't see there ever being a reason to stop theorizing about what comes next. That's the thing about humanity is we're not going to ever be done being human, right? At some point, we're going to always say, it would be a little bit better? A flying car. Do you know what would be a little bit better? A robot made, right? I mean, like there's always going to be a horizon, right? And the best thing about horizons is if you sail towards them, theoretically you might never reach it.
A little bit of a turn here that actually ties back to your mention of Philip K. Dick. I'd like to know if you'd like to speak just a little bit about alternative history as a premise and how you see that in the realm of science fiction. And the most obvious example is probably The Man in the High Castle. And if you have some other examples of particularly good works along those lines.
Man in the High Castle is one of the best, right? This is the dreaded alternate history had we failed to win World War II. Right, so it's America divided East Coast and West Coast by German forces and Japanese forces, and how the black market operates and how they sort of unravel the whole idea that they are living in an alternate history, and there is a history where things had gone the right way. The one that I like, the alternate history that I like a lot is called The Lucky Strike, and it's by Kim Stanley Robinson. It's a short story, about 35 pages. And the premise of the story is one weld was misplaced on an airplane that crashed during training. So the Enola Gay never sailed. And the other crew, the pilot or the bombardier has a crisis of consciousness, and they don't drop it on Hiroshima, but rather on an island offshore, and how it plays out after that. It's a really great story. Because they get this guy for disobeying a direct order, and ultimately he pays the price for doing the right thing. And it's an amazing story. You should definitely try to get your hands on it.
But there's a guy an author named Harry Turtledove, who does a lot of series of alternate history. As far as where it fits in, we've all pretty much decided that since alternate history is really cool, yes, it's science fiction.
Well, it theorizes.
Right.
It says if this were to change, how would it play out?
Be? Right.
Right. Another alternate history, if you are interested in comic books at all, Watchmen is fantastic. It's basically American history plays out as it does until June 1938, when this little magazine called Action Comics comes out. And then all of history moving forward from there is different. It's kind of cool.
Okay, next question right here in front.
My question is really a broad one, though, and the topic is so broad, but I'm curious to know what you think about the storytelling nowadays, trends in science fiction today versus back in the 60s versus back in, older times than that. Is it different? Is it going in a particular direction? What would you say about the trends?
In the beginning, science fiction was considered to be a very positive, forward-looking, the future is going to be great, we're going to build it and help you all get there. Kind of a general gestalt of the genre. I'd say, what would you say, the last 30 years, 20 years, something like that? We've seen an awful lot of post-apocalyptic, the future is not so great and it's going to be awful into
40 years.
Yeah, okay. And so much so that one of the reasons that we brought the magazine Amazing Stories back out was to say, hey, the future is still someplace that we want to go as long as certain improvements are made, and we want a science fiction magazine out there that's reflecting that concept. It's now kind of morphed into this thing they're calling hope punk, which is, punk is short for this kind of fetish in writing and that kind of fetish in writing. But the general concept is we want to get away from apocalyptic and post-apocalyptic concepts and back to the idea that the future can be shaped into something positive. There is hope for humanity, kind of a thing.
The direction in science fiction is proliferation. There are so many authors contributing to the field, and there really isn't a single genre that is dominating the discourse.
Dan asked me to give you a little history on the magazine. Real briefly, Gernsback emigrated from Luxembourg to the United States, I think, in 1912. He was an inventor himself. He was very enamored of science. If you think about the time frame, this was the height of the Industrial Revolution. Machines were being created to do everything that you could possibly imagine. And there was a feeling culturally that science and technology could solve all of our problems. We just had to be smart enough and interested enough to figure out how to accomplish whatever. Gernsback bought this idea and wanted to encourage people to get involved with the sciences, and he conceived of this magazine that would publish stories about science and technology that would entice people to get involved in science and technology. He called it Candy Coating the Science. Electronics and radio distribution company at the time. Radio was big. He broadcast some of the first television broadcasts from New York City with experimental television sets. invented all kinds of interesting and strange things, but the magazine hit the stands and just exploded back in 1926. So much so, and this is somewhat theoretical, there's been a lot of research done, but no definitive conclusion. He lost the magazine and his publishing empire to a competing publisher in a forced bankruptcy scheme, is basically what it comes down to. He immediately went on to found the second and third science fiction magazines in the field, which also became successful. But he basically started the genre in a pulp fashion and making this kind of literature as a specific type available to an audience. The magazine was purchased by a succession of publishers. It ended up with the Dungeons and Dragons company, which then got purchased by Wizards of the Coast to make Magic the Gathering the card game, which was then purchased by Hasbro. Hasbro is a large corporation. They have a decent intellectual property department, but for some reason their philosophy on dealing with intellectual property is never license anything, never sell anything, just let it lapse, which allowed me to pick up the name in 2008, which is a good thing because the people applying for the mark before me were going to use it for a name for travel books, and those of us in the science fiction community think that would have been a tragedy. We started a website in 2012. We started regular publication of the magazine in 2018. We have a series of books and anthologies that mine the history of the magazine, as well as all new fiction in the current mag. And of course, I've mentioned the television show a couple of times. So that's pretty much where we're at with the magazine. AmazingStories.com.
Well, that's where you get back into the science fiction as a niche audience object, right? I mean, there are a lot of movies that come out that have sort of the trappings of science fiction, but there are very few science fiction movies. Ex Machina is a really good science fiction movie. Children of Men was a really, really, really good science fiction movie. There have been, sort of more, it tends to lean more toward the art house. It tends to be sort of smaller production, smaller budget type things. I mean, by Hollywood standards, even The Matrix was a low budget film. I mean, they accomplished most of what they did in that first film through camera trickery rather than through like CGI or anything of that nature. But as soon as it became an object in which the studios were willing to invest, then the studios got really interested in their return on investment. And then I think that the content of the stories drops off immediately. So a lot of it has to do with, when you say that like Hollywood, it doesn't get science fiction right, it has a lot to do with the fact that in order to invest the millions of dollars that it takes to produce a high budget, Hollywood film, they need to ensure that they're going to receive 10 times that amount in ticket receipts. So, I mean, one of the things that allowed for the pulp era of science fiction and even the sort of the contemporary era of print science fiction to exist is the relative low cost of production in comparison to other mediums. I mean, video games, for example. Video games could be a spectacular medium for delivery of science fiction stuff, but that rarely happens. And mainly because return on investment is the priority of a producer. I mean, this is, what you were saying about sort of the getting turned off by the commerciality of the cons and things like that. Yeah, I mean, I completely get that. But the thing is the producers are looking for bigger fish. And the bigger fish the bigger audience, the larger audience doesn't really look for this. It is still by and large a niche, genre.
But what they, of course, what they miss is that it's in the ghetto where the new stuff is generated out of necessity, if nothing else.
Oh no, yeah. And I think that they have their eye, like there's always a sort of a path by which something goes from a marginal audience to a mainstream audience, and a lot of that sort of transition has a lot to do with exterior investment. Like if all of a sudden something is relatively successful within its own audience, community, or whatnot, then suddenly production comes in, and then they start sanding down the things that made the object what it was for its niche audience in order for it to appeal to a much broader audience.
No, absolutely. And whether you want to call that diluting or which is a negative way of approaching it, or give it some other term that it doesn't imply negativity, it is part of the dynamic. But where I come from, where I was educated in my fanishness, was there was a phrase, it's hardly ever used anymore, but the professionals in the field at conventions and in fanzines were referred to, only half-jokingly, as filthy pros. And the reason why that term and the accompanying term for folks who were selling in the dealer's room was the huckster's room, not the dealer's room, was because there was this cultural imperative to separate commercial interests from the fanishness, and it was an attempt to keep what we're seeing now from happening, because they all recognized this dynamic, this flow of niche interest to broad cultural distribution.
Right. In other words, they want their cake and eat it too.
Absolutely.
Right. They want to produce what they want to produce, but they want a built-in audience for that.
Right, and they want to be well paid without having to pay the price for it to be well paid.
Yeah. That would be a great dream.
Yeah, it would be, and I personally exist in the realm of, with the magazine in particular, I am much more fond of older science fiction than I am of the newer science fiction. And that's just me, and it doesn't influence anything. But I hired an editor familiar with the contemporary field specifically because I recognized for any chance of commercial success with the magazine, I have to appeal to the current audience, not the vanishing breed of people like myself. So there is this dichotomy, this tension between the two. And what I also find is over time we have an explosion because everybody is trying to get their little bit out of it, and then it dies off, and we end up at a higher plateau in the long run, with a lot more people exposed to it, but not so much. The edges get whittled away, kind of a thing, and then eventually we go for another kind of a plateau. So right now we're in the explosion phase where there's a lot of stuff, and according to Sturgeon, 90% of it is crap, which is absolutely true. But in the long run, we'll benefit from having gone through this explosion.
All right, so I just want to end with one question, and that is, a lot of themes run through science fiction over time. And one theme that connects to today that, I don't know if there's a lesson to learn or not, is pandemics. So pandemics are a foundation for science fiction. Can you sort of address that as a theme, and what lessons you might have learned that we could use?
What's the quote from Aliens?
Oh, it's I think we should nuke it from orbit.
You're right. Yeah. I think we should nuke it from orbit. Well, if you remember, probably most are familiar with the movie Andromeda Strain. It was based on Crichton's novel of the same name. If you remember, the laboratory had a built-in safety device, which was a nuclear bomb. So it's not that far-fetched to...
I hate to go, I don't know if there's any happy ending pandemic novels. They're like, oh yeah, that wasn't that big a deal. Like at the end of it, yeah, it's the one that I'm thinking of is Max Brooks's World War Z, which the movie is entirely disconnected from the book. The book is basically a character does Studs Terkel's Hard Times, like the Studs Terkel's journalism of the Great Depression, but after the zombie war. So he goes around the world and and does interviews with the first doctors who encountered what they were calling African rabies in Cape Town. and then moving forward to a soldier who was on the front line at the Battle of Yonkers, and like goes through the entire sort of history of it. And the thing that's remarkable about the book is how much incredible interplay is necessary between different nations in order to alleviate a global phenomenon. The other thing is that it really locks in on what are the right things to do, what are the wrong things to do, and what are the right things that are fundamentally difficult decisions to do. It's a really good book. The chapter that I'm thinking of right now is initially when the outbreak takes place, somebody makes a tremendous amount of money selling a cure that was ultimately ineffective. That was intentionally, it was understood that it was ineffective, but that they would sell it. I believe this is in the news this week. Not to get into politics.
If you think about it, a pandemic and the way that it's used in science fiction is very similar to alien invasion. It's an existential threat to the species, and we can explore ways to deal with it, the consequences of it, how society is reshaped by it. There are any number of stories that take a global pandemic as their starting point, as in the reason why the world is as it is now is because 90% of the species died off from this disease, kind of a thing. And it's in those cases, and in most of the pandemic stories I'm familiar with, that's all it is a mechanism to wipe the face of most people so that we can introduce a totally new society.
I mean, it is a conceit in order to reduce the population, in order to make them more manageable for the sake of your narrative, more than anything else.
Sort of like a cleansing, huh?
Yeah. Or, nuclear war, or the aliens needing the planet. It's all the same kind of thing.
Well, actually, when we were walking up, my son asked me, like, well, what if the world ends? And I said, well, son, the world's not going anywhere. We might be.
Right, the world's okay. Well, please join me in thanking our panelists.
Live from New Hampshire, it's time for the Science Cafe!
Learn about the latest technologic innovations today.
And you don't have to pay.
Expert panels with advanced degrees are sure to satisfy your curiosity.
Did we mention it's free?
And if you think you'll find a better time than this, then come on down and test your hypothesis. 'Cause you're gonna learn a lot if you wanna stay down at the Science Cafe.